Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 30 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Vancouver Canucks, in which the Sharks have lost 5-2. And it was only a few games ago where the Sharks faced off against the Columbus Blue Jackets and ended up losing 6-4, where in the post-game comments, Bob Booner made sure to mention that felt like the most disappointing game of the season up to that point. Well, after tonight's game against the Vancouver Canucks, that Blue Jackets game certainly has some competition, because this was yet another very disappointing loss for the Sharks, because they definitely did play well enough to win. And it's not just that they looked pretty good in this game, it's just that the Canucks got a couple of bounces. But this was a game where the Sharks were, I would say, a pretty wide margin better than the Vancouver Canucks for a good 45 to maybe even 50 minutes of this game, and yet ended up losing by a pretty unattractive score of 5-2. Now, if we start off here in this first period, like I said, the Sharks, it felt as though had the majority of the chances in the first period, and yet the few chances that the Canucks did get, they did manage to capitalize on. Brock Besser would make it 1-0, then on the power play, Bo Horvat would make it 2-0. A minute later or so, the Sharks would be able to cut the lead in half with a Timo Meier goal, and that would be the final score at the end of the first period. In the second period, the Sharks would continue tilting the ice in their favor and would kind of even turn it up a notch as well. The Vancouver Canucks did not register a shot for the first 3 quarters of this second period. The Sharks were just absolutely skating circles around Vancouver, who just kind of looked very lost for the majority of that second period. Anytime the Canucks even brought it into the offensive zone, the Sharks were able to block shots and immediately clear it out. So very impressive second period, at least defensively, for the Sharks. And yet by the end of it, not only did the Sharks not manage to score the game-tying goal to make it 2-2, but in fact actually found themselves falling further behind in this game, as Brock Besser in the last couple of minutes of the second would score his second goal of the game, and it would be 3-1 after a pretty dominant 40 minutes for the San Jose Sharks. It's kind of weird to say that it was a dominant 40 minutes for the Sharks, even though they were trailing 3-1, but that's kind of how it felt like. The Sharks had some great chances here tonight. They just couldn't really get any past the Canucks goaltender, who had himself a fantastic performance, Thatcher Demko, and so they were trailing 3-1 after 40. In the third period, the Sharks kind of looked a bit asleep at the wheel, seemingly very demotivated by how the first 40 minutes of this game went. And so for the first 8 minutes, the Canucks were doing to the Sharks what the Sharks had done to the Canucks for the previous parts of this game. But eventually, the Sharks managed to break through. Pretty lucky play, you could say. This one just kind of sneaks through Thatcher Demko through the 5-hole, and Andrew Cogliano brings it to within 1, and that really woke up the San Jose Sharks. They started getting some more chances like they had been doing earlier on in the game. They were getting some great ones onto Demko, but eventually it would actually be JT Miller who would get the Canucks back into a 2-goal lead, and with that goal, it felt as though the Sharks just kind of had all of the wind taken out of their sails. Eventually, the Sharks would pull the goaltender, but the Sharks were just skating so sluggishly after that JT Miller goal that it was a very easy empty netter for Dickinson to score, and the Canucks ended up winning it 5-2. Now, I'm going to move on to the lineup, but instead of starting off here with the first line like I normally do, I'm actually going to start off with the goaltender, as Aidan Hill got the start here tonight, which was rather surprising. I didn't think that the previous start for James Reimer went all that badly against Seattle. Like I said, he actually looked pretty good in that game, and so I suspected he would get another start here tonight against the Canucks, especially when you consider how many starts in a row that Hill got when Reimer was injured. But for whatever reason, Bob Booner decides to go back to Aidan Hill, and that is now looking like a mistake, as what we have seen from his performance here tonight. I have made the comparison between Aidan Hill and Martin Jones many times in the past. Usually that comparison has rested on a couple of facts. The first one being that Aidan Hill, like Martin Jones, had a tendency to let in about 1 bad goal per game. And the second thing would rest on the fact that both goaltenders seemed to give up a goal early on in the first, 3, 4, 5 minutes of the first period. But here tonight, I'm going to actually compare him for a different reason to Martin Jones, and more of a Martin Jones from the 18-19 season, when the Sharks were quite dominant, yet were dominating through some pretty bad goaltending. And that's basically the case here tonight. It's that the Sharks got some great chances, but when they gave up the few opportunities to the Vancouver Canucks, Aidan Hill just wasn't really there to make the save. Because of these first 3 goals, at the very least, for the Canucks, the 2 Besser goals and the Bo Horvat one, there's none here that I'd say, wow, Aidan Hill definitely should have had that. What a terrible goal to let in. But besides the Horvat one, which was just a cross-ice pass on the power play that should never be able to make through, and it's a really tough save for Hill, though not impossible. The 2 Besser goals were ones where they're in close and there's some nice shots by Besser, but you'd maybe like to see Hill make at least one save on one of those shots, especially when you look at the other side of the ice where Thatcher Demko was just heroically keeping the Vancouver Canucks in this game. And so it's kind of like something that I would say so constantly with Martin Jones when he was the goaltender back in that 18-19 season, and to a lesser extent in the 19-20 and 20-21 seasons, where it wasn't a situation where Jones was playing super terribly, but he just wasn't really giving the Sharks a chance to win game in and game out. And that's something that Hill really struggled with here tonight. He just didn't really give the Sharks a chance to win with those first 3 goals. Where it kind of completely tanks is with this 4th goal by JT Miller, and this is really where the Sharks got completely demoralized after it was let in. This is a shot from rather far out. There's no traffic in front. It's not deflected at all, and Aidan Hill just somehow gets beat completely cleanly. And what makes it look even worse is that just a few seconds earlier, Thatcher Demko makes a miraculous save onto Logan Couture on the other side of the ice. And so just the stark comparison between both goaltenders' performances here tonight really makes Aidan Hill just not look like he had a good night at all. I was, as I said, quite surprised Reimer didn't get the start, and it was just a disappointing performance for Aidan Hill once again. A very interesting stat that they gave on the broadcast here tonight is that Hill, he started the season 3-0. The Sharks, as we know, started the year 4-0 right out the gate. But ever since that 3-0 start for Aidan Hill, in his last 12 games, he has gone 3-9. Obviously, completely terrible stats, especially if you are to compare them to Reimer, who has been much more positive for the Sharks. Now, moving on to the actual forward lines here, I actually thought a couple of them looked rather good. The first line was reunited, Meyer, Couture, and Dahlen put together once more, and they had a couple of great chances through the first couple of periods in this game. The third period, they definitely fell off a bit, but I definitely liked Dahlen's performance here tonight. Had a couple of great passes and a couple of great opportunities for himself against his former team, the Vancouver Canucks, who ended up sort of, I guess you could say, giving up on him and trading him away to the San Jose Sharks, or trading him away, not actually to the Sharks, I don't believe, traded him away for kind of scraps at that point. Couture and Meyer also had some pretty solid games for themselves. On the second line is really where there was the most interesting player of the game, and that would be Helbegowatz, who got called up before the previous game against Seattle, but didn't actually manage to make it into the lineup for that one, but he does make it into the lineup, and on the second line, which is actually rather surprising. In previous years with Bob Bruner, even when he's called up players, or when players have been called up from the AHL, he's been very... He frequently would end up just putting them on the fourth line and playing them like 8 minutes a night, and then saying, wow, this young player who I'm playing 8 minutes a night on the fourth line with Curtis Gabriel didn't do well. Well, clearly this guy's just not good enough. But there was seemingly a message shift from management to Bob Bruner that he needs to be giving more opportunities to these younger players, and so we've seen it happen with Noah Gregor, we saw it happen with William Eklund, with Jonathan Dahlen, these players immediately getting an opportunity in the top six, and that's exactly what happens here with Helbegowatz, and he certainly did not look like a fish out of water, definitely pun intended there. He had some great shifts, he had a breakaway in tonight's game. He had some good offensive instincts. His defensive game obviously left a bit to be desired, but definitely not terrible, at least when you compare it to certain other players on the Sharks, like his line mate Barabanov, and just generally I thought Helbegowatz had a very good game here tonight, and Bob Bruner clearly thought the same thing, as Helbegowatz ended up getting close to 17 minutes here in his first career NHL game very close to scoring. He had some great setups. It was just a very impressive game, and something that I wasn't really expecting from him. I remember it was a few years ago where he was coming off of an over 70 goal season in the WHL, but I believe he was an overager in that year, so the hype was obviously tempered. He came into the AHL. He did okay with the San Jose Barracuda, but never enough to really get that call up. And then a couple years passed, nothing really came. And so it seemed as though nothing would ever really amount for his career. But he gets the call up. He continued working. He makes it to the Sharks roster, gets into the top 6 with Hertl and Barabanov, and puts up a very impressive first career game. When it comes to Hertl and Barabanov, his two line mates also looked rather impressive. Maybe just the introduction of this young player playing their first game really invigorated these two, because they looked definitely a lot better than they have in the past couple. When it comes to the third line, there was a bit of a change, surprisingly. We had many times seen the Nieto, Bonino, Cogliano line, and I was very impressed with that line game in and game out over the past few, but for whatever reason, they decided to go back with the Nieto, Bonino, Gregor line that we saw back in the road trip a few games ago when Cogliano left for personal reasons, and Cogliano ended up getting moved to the fourth line. I'm not entirely sure why. It's not that I dislike the Bonino-Gregor duo that we saw, which was actually having some pretty decent chemistry a couple of weeks ago, but it feels a bit odd to disrupt the really good chemistry that Nieto, Bonino, and Cogliano had been generating, and we saw here tonight it didn't really work out. This third line didn't necessarily do all that much. Gregor, while he showcased some nice speed, looked a bit lost at times and had some issues in the defensive zone as well. And so the third line, it had been here for a while, but then it was at this level here tonight. And when it comes to the fourth line, I was still decently impressed with Cogliano, though certainly not at the level that he was at when he was playing with his usual line mates Bonino and Nieto. When it comes to the other two players here, Peterson does get his first point of the season, which I guess is nice, and then Weatherby, I guess, exists in the lineup for the Sharks, but it's pretty clear that Bob Brunner has the bare minimum trust in these two players at this point. I mean, both of them getting 7 minutes of ice time here tonight, which is just insanely low. You know, fourth liners, they could usually get at least around 10 minutes. So the fact that they're not even getting close to that shows that they're basically just warm bodies filling up the 11th and 12th forward spot. And I'd like to see some sort of massive shakeup happen. Maybe once Balcers and LeBanc do return to the lineup. LeBanc is more injured long term, of course, but Balcers should be back relatively soon, within a couple of weeks, maybe after the Christmas break. And hopefully we can see some sort of shakeup with that fourth line at that point. On to the defensive side of things, pretty interesting swap we saw. So Burns and Ferraro have been a pairing for the entirety of this season thus far, but at the start of the game here tonight, they were probably the weakest pairing for the San Jose Sharks, not looking particularly good to start off this game, even in a first period where the Sharks looked like the better team. And so by the time the third period rolled around, we actually saw some interesting experimentation with these top two pairings, swapping Ferraro onto the pairing with Erik Karlsson and moving Middleton up to the top pairing with Brent Burns. I don't know how much of a difference this is going to make. Maybe this is just a bit of a wake-up call for both Burns and Ferraro, who had been not doing terribly over the past few games, but haven't really been at a very high level either. But it was definitely an interesting swap to see, because, like I said, these two players, or I guess you could say these four players, these two pairings, have been together for the entirety of this season, as long as they have been healthy. So the fact that they've been swapped is clearly a massive message being sent by Bob Brunner. When it comes to that second pairing of Karlsson and Middleton, or Karlsson and Ferraro, I thought Karlsson in particular still had a pretty solid game. There were obviously the odd turnovers in the defensive zone. Those were still some things that hopefully Erik Karlsson can come closer to avoiding in more games in the future. But obviously there was also a lot of offensive opportunities brought by Erik Karlsson, so it's kind of hard to talk a lot of trash about him for a game like this, because while the defense can be suspect at times, the offense kind of outweighs it. And as long as that continues to be the case, it's hard to say that Karlsson has had a bad game. Finally, when it comes to the third pairing of Vlasic and Shemek, once again, a pretty solid performance for these two players. Vlasic, there were a couple of issues, but I thought Radim Shemek continued to look rather solid like he has in these past couple of games, so that was definitely nice to see. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action. They're actually going to get a bit of a break here, as their next game is going to be taking place next week on Tuesday, where they will take on the Edmonton Oilers. The Oilers had been on a massive skid, but they did manage to get a victory here tonight. tonight. McDavid and Draisaitl always going to be a massive threat no matter what, so we'll see if the Sharks, potentially with new defensive pairings, will be able to shut down those two players and get back into the win column. Class dismissed.